So you need to remember the story about the eunuch, because we're going to talk about that later. Just footnote, okay? Not today. Vines and vineyards, that's today. When I think about a vineyard, I can't help but think about driving up to see my brother-in-law in Napa. And the row after row and mile after mile of grapevines you see along the edge of the road. And if you look at them closely, you see stakes and then wires and then grapevines coming up and being directed to grow along the wires. It's very orderly, it's very uniform, and it's taking over more and more land. There are places where I used to admire the cattle that now I see grapevines. I'm not sure I'm happy about that, but there you are. It's very regimented, very directed. Now, in contrast to that, the next vine I think of is kudzu. Now, Ruby and Doug, and anybody who's been to the South can tell you about kudzu. Kudzu grows wherever it wants to go. Period, end of discussion. The rumor is that it grows 6 inches a day, which is a lot. You can almost watch it move, that's right. It will cover cars, it will cover telephone poles and run along the wire, it will cover an entire house if it has enough time. You can find pictures, if you Google kudzu, you can find pictures of entire scenes that is nothing but odd shapes covered in green. It's stunning. It's also invasive, which is why it grows like that. There are jokes in the South about mulching kudzu with concrete cinder blocks, which is the only thing that will slow it down, and that's not true, it won't. However, when I read about kudzu last night, I learned it is a highly respected vine in China and Japan for its herbal properties, and they use it for healing. It's supposed to help with migraine headaches, cereal headaches, and I've forgotten what the third thing was. It was amazing. I was like, really? Someplace on earth that it's supposed to be on purpose. So who knew? I mean, they farm this stuff there. So go figure. The third thing I think about are the morning glories that my neighbor has planted that have come over her fence into our backyard, and which, if we let them, will run up the side of our house. So we routinely have to go cut at the bottom of the fence to keep them under control. And then it's not a vine, but I thought about my roses, because when I prune my roses, I'm always pruning to keep the really long stems from getting too gangly, and I'm pruning them to keep the center open for more blossoms, more fruit, if you will. And it's that combination of all those different kinds of plants and the pruning that made me think about some general kind of points about vines. And I wrote those down because I didn't want to forget any. So here we go. Grapevines are highly structured. We talked about that. And they're structured that way to increase how much fruit they bear. I have a hard time thinking of myself as a grapevine pruned by God, because I don't think I'm quite that contorted. But the idea of being pruned to be more productive makes sense to me, because we do that with almost every plant that bears fruit. We pinch out the little suckers on the tomato plants. We cut back the roses so they'll bloom some more. We pinch out stuff on fruit trees so that the branches that are left have enough food. If you're feeding a bunch of gangly branches, you don't have food for the fruit, right? So that makes sense to me. Branches. We are the branches. This is a great metaphor. The more I think about it, the more I think it's just brilliant. If we are the branches, that means we all have a common source, right? But we're all individuals, and we all can go our own way to a point. And we are the branches. We are not the vine, and we are certainly not the vine keeper. So that means it's not our job to assess how the other branches are doing, right? We're in charge of our own branch, and that's pretty much all we're in charge of, bearing fruit on our branch. It's also a reality that branches grow in lots of different directions. Some of those directions may not be as beneficial as others. It's also not our job to make that assessment. We have enough to do, I think, worrying about our own branch, going where we've been kind of encouraged to go, and bearing our own fruit. We are branches, we are an integral part of the plant. If you think about it, if you have just the stem and no branches, there's not going to be any fruit. You have to have a branch to have a fruit. We are necessary. Now, the fact that there are other vines with other branches makes us not like totally necessary, but if you don't have a branch, there is no place for the fruit. The other thing that struck me was that the vine provides support. I think very often we think about God and God's support coming like down, which can be kind of impositional, but this is like a basis, right? This is like support up from which we grow as branches, or out from which we grow as branches. It's a little bit different. So it's a metaphor that works for us and for Jesus. And I want you to look at the word abide. It's used a whole lot in this passage. I abide in the Father, you abide in me, and with an end, on and on. Abide means remain, stay, that kind of context. And so what Jesus, I think, is trying to say to us is this. If you will stay where you belong, basically, you will have the support you need to do what you're called to do. Just as I stay rooted in the Father and have what I need to do, what I'm called to do. Jesus came to be an exemplar for us. We say in our Eucharistic prayer, words weren't enough. We needed somebody walking around and doing the things we're called to do and being the way we're called to be, and that would be Jesus. And Jesus is saying, if you will abide in me, remain with me, you will have what you need to bear the fruit you are called to bear. And what is the branch's job? Bear fruit. That's the purpose, to the glory of God. Notice there is no definition of what fruit is. So I came up with a general one. I haven't gotten struck yet, so I think it's okay. I think bearing fruit means living as intentionally as we know how to live, using the gifts that we have been given individually and corporately to be God's presence here, so that other people come to know about God's love and God's grace, and they're being already loved. That's, I think, bearing fruit. And if a couple of people come along and make some commitments on the way, that's great. But I don't think we count how many noses are in the pews to say, oh, we're bearing fruit. I think it's about, are we glorifying God? Are we living our life in a way that glorifies God? Individually and corporately. That's when we're bearing fruit. But we're not called to do it alone. We are just a branch. We're not the whole plant. We're certainly not the whole vineyard. In one of the translations I read, it said, you're the branch, I'm the vine, and my Father is the vineyard keeper, which talks about more than one vine, lots of different vines. Remember all those different sheep and flocks last week? There are other ones besides us. And so, out of all that, here's what I want you to remember. We need the vine. The vine needs us. But we need the vine. Our purpose is to bear fruit. So, here are my questions for you. Where in your life are you bearing fruit? And where in your life do you need a little pruning? Pruning doesn't have to be arduous or painful. It can be changing direction slightly. It can be remembering that we're the branch and not the vine. It can be insights into something new you want to take on or something you need to give up. All of us need a little pruning. It's just how we are. Where are you bearing fruit? And where do you need a little pruning?